Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the Bilingual Professor podcast. I'm Dr. Kevin Wong, trained elementary school teacher, now teacher educator and researcher, and apparently a podcaster by night once the kids go to bed. This podcast is a space for parents, teachers, and anyone who cares about bilingualism, really. Not just the mechanics of it, but the lived reality of it. The messy, beautiful, sometimes guilt-ridden experience of raising or educating kids in more than one language. And today we're going after the myth that I hear most often, the one that has probably done more damage to bilingual families than any other single idea in the history of language education. The idea that bilingual children get confused. You know, when your child mixes languages mid-sentence or pauses to find a word or uses English when you expected Spanish, and somewhere a voice is saying to you, they're confused. Now, I want to spend this episode doing two things. First, I want to show you exactly what that voice is responding to, what the observable behaviors are that get mistaken for confusion. And then I want to show you with cognitive science why that interpretation is not just wrong, but almost precisely the opposite of what's happening. Because what looks like confusion from the outside is actually one of the most sophisticated cognitive performances a human being can produce. When you understand what's actually happening in a bilingual brain, that is. So let's get into the science. First, let's name what actually prompts the confusion narrative. There are three observable behaviors in bilingual children that get misread as confusion. And so I'm going to walk through each one and explain what the cognitive science says is actually happening. The first is language mixing, what researchers call code switching, what we've heard of as Spanglish, Chinglish. A child produces a sentence that draws from both languages. I want to go to the Gongyun park in Cantonese. Can we eat jiaozi tonight? Dumpling in Mandarin. Well, on the surface, this looks like the languages are kind of bleeding into one another, like the child can't keep them straight or something. The deficit interpretation is they don't know which language they're even speaking. The second is vocabulary gaps. A child who seems to know a word in one language but not the other, or who reaches for a word, pauses, thinks, and ultimately can't find it. The deficit perspective is their vocabulary is incomplete. They're falling behind. The third is the silent period, a stretch of time when a child who has been exposed to a second language produces very little, if any, of it. The deficit interpretation is the language is not taking hold. Something must be wrong. Now, let me take each of these and show you what the cognitive science actually says. In 1995, Fred Genesee and his colleagues published one of the most important studies in bilingualism research. They directly tested the question, do bilingual children separate their two language systems, or do they operate with a fused single system? What they found was clear. Even bilingual children as young as 2 years old consistently and systematically separated their languages based on who they were talking to. They spoke one language to one parent and a different language to the other. When an unfamiliar adult entered the room and addressed them, they calibrated their language choice to match that person's language. They were not confused about which language was which. They were making sociolinguistic judgments. In other words, reading the context of communication and selecting the appropriate linguistic code with a precision that honestly most adults never consciously develop. Think about what that means. A 2-year-old who looks at a new adult identifies which languages that person is using and responds in kind is not a child who has mixed up two systems. That's a child operating two parallel systems simultaneously and switching between them with contextual accuracy. So what is actually happening neurologically when a bilingual person speaks? Research using neuroimaging has shown that both language systems are actually active simultaneously in a bilingual brain, even when the person is only using one language. So both of these languages are, quote, online. Both are competing, in a sense, for selection. And the bilingual brain manages this through a mechanism researchers call inhibitory control, the ability to suppress the language not currently in use while activating the one that is. Again, this is not confusion. This is a real-time cognitive management of two competing linguistic systems. It's neurologically demanding, sophisticated work. And bilingual brains do it constantly, automatically, beginning in the first years of life. Now, here's where the science gets even more remarkable, because the inhibitory control mechanism I just described, the constant management of two active language systems, doesn't just handle language. Ellen Bialystok is a cognitive psychologist at York University who has spent decades studying what bilingualism does to the brain. In a landmark body of research, she and her colleagues found that bilingual individuals consistently outperform monolinguals on tasks measuring executive function. Those are the set of cognitive skills that govern our ability to focus attention, filter out irrelevant information, switch between competing tasks, and hold multiple pieces of information in mind simultaneously. The reason Bialystok argues is exactly what we just discussed. Because a bilingual brain is continuously exercising the inhibitory control mechanism, suppressing one language while using another, selecting between competing linguistic options in real time, it develops unusually strong cognitive control networks. The brain region responsible for this work, particularly the prefrontal cortex and the anterior cingulate cortex, show enhanced efficiency in bilingual individuals compared to monolinguals. This has been documented across the lifespan as well. Bilingual children show advantages in executive function tasks in early childhood. Bilingual adults show more efficient cognitive control under conditions of interference and distraction. And in older age, research suggests that lifelong bilingualism is associated with a delay in the onset of dementia symptoms by an average of 4 to 5 years. So the brain that has been managing two language systems for decades appears to have built a cognitive reserve that protects against age-related decline. So the main message is this: managing two language systems builds cognitive machinery that transfers to other domains of thinking. So the confusion myth has it precisely backwards. The brain is not divided by bilingualism, it's actually strengthened by it. There's a third dimension of the bilingual brain that I believe is least talked about as well, but super interesting. It's called metalinguistic awareness, the ability to think about language as a system, to step outside of what you are saying and observe how it's constructed. Monolingual children develop metalinguistic awareness gradually, typically accelerating around the time they learn to read. Bilingual children, however, develop it earlier and with greater depth. The reason is a child who operates in two languages encounters from a very early age the fact that language is socially constructed, that it's kind of arbitrary. The same object has two different names. The same concept can be expressed through two entirely different grammatical structures. When you put languages side by side like that, you can't help but notice the differences. Bialystok's research showed that bilingual children outperform monolingual peers on tasks requiring them to analyze the structure of language independently of its meaning. Tasks like recognizing that a grammatically correct but semantically absurd sentence is still grammatically correct, or understanding that word length is unrelated to the size of the thing the word names. These are not trivial skills. They're foundational to reading comprehension, writing development, and abstract reasoning. A bilingual child who mixes language in conversation is not demonstrating an inability to keep systems separate. They're operating within a metalinguistic sophistication that allows them to draw on both systems strategically, choosing the word or the phrase or the right register that best serves the communicative context. Again, they're not confused. They're precise. And for those of you who have traveled to another country where English is not spoken and you're constantly comparing between languages to make sure you get it right, that's the cognitive workout that our bilingual kids are engaging in. Now I want to bring the science back down to the kitchen table because I think it's important that these findings don't just live in research papers and journals. They should change how you see your child on an ordinary Tuesday. When your child switches languages mid-sentence or pauses and searches for a word, what you're often seeing is the process of selecting between two competing options. Both languages are active, both are offering possible words or phrases to use, and the child is arbitrating between them. So the pause of hesitation is not a gap, but processing time, which gets more and more efficient with practice, like a muscle growing stronger with each repetition. Now, everything I've described today is about typical bilingual development, language mixing, code switching, uneven vocabulary distribution, and silent periods. These are all normal and expected features of bilingual language acquisition. They are not, however, indicators of language delay or disorder. The research is clear that bilingualism does not cause language delays, but it is equally clear that bilingual children can experience delays just as monolingual children can, and those deserve proper assessment. So going back to the beginning when I introduced today's topic, the deficit narrative says, my bilingual child is confused. The cognitive science says, my bilingual child is running one of the most sophisticated neural operations a human brain can perform. Let's sit with that for a moment. The confusion myth is not just factually wrong, it's a failure of imagination about what is actually happening inside a bilingual child's brain. It takes something extraordinary, the simultaneous management of two complete linguistic systems, the constant exercise of inhibitory control, the early development of metalinguistic awareness, the capacity to navigate two entirely different ways of structuring meaning and reality, and mistakes it for confusion as a deficit. Your child's bilingualism is a cognitive architecture that they are building. Every time they navigate between two languages, every code switch, every moment of selection, every pause before the right word, they're doing construction work on a brain that will think more flexibly, focus more effectively, and stay sharper for longer. And that's remarkable. And I think it's worth saying out loud to your child who probably doesn't hear it enough in their bilingual journey, and to yourself who may often feel discouraged or weighed down when bilingual development doesn't occur in a linear fashion or as you might expect it to. Next episode, we're going to turn from what's happening in the brain to what's happening in the parent. We're going to talk about the belief that your language isn't good enough to pass on, that your, quote, imperfect grammar or limited vocabulary disqualifies you from raising a bilingual child. The research on this is just as clear, and it's something I want to address directly because I think it stops a lot of parents before they even begin. So if this episode shifted something for you, share it with a parent, a teacher, or a friend who needs to hear it. The confusion myth travels by word of mouth, but so does the truth. I'm Dr. Kevin Wong. Thank you for listening to the Bilingual Professor Podcast. Hatsikina.